Greetings, fellow Watch Comrades, and welcome into the show. I'm Craig Hester, the Watch Comrade, and we really appreciate you joining us today. We're real excited because today we're going to be talking about one of the most important watches in the history of Russian horology. That is the Strela, which means arrow in Russian. Specifically today we're going to be talking about a reissue produced by Sturmanskie, which is owned by the company Volmax out of Moscow. Now, any of you who are familiar with Russian watches know both of those names. They have reissued the Strela chronograph in two versions we're going to be talking about today that are just excellent examples of everything you look for in a Russian watch. The original Strela, which began in 1959 is when it was introduced, used a 30-17 movement. The 3017 was a Venus 150, basically, altered somewhat to be to fit for the Russian model, and that watch was introduced in 1959 to the Russian military, specifically to the Air Force, to aviators, and it was only to military specs, and it actually wasn't available to the public at the time. Now, that was a 19-jewel column wheel chronograph, the 3017, that the original Strela was, the platform that the original Strela used. Now, what really made the Strela famous was in 1965 when it was worn on the first ever human spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. That's really what put the Strela into the stratosphere, so to speak, into the Russian watch collecting stratosphere, because that just made it, well, first of all, it was a chronograph, it was a complicated watch, and after they released it to the public, you could really own a piece of Russian watch history. You know, you can get, of course, there still are available out there reproductions of Gagarin's watch, the first watch ever worn by a human in space. In fact, Volmax is going to be coming out with another reproduction next year, and there are, from even the original line, of course the original isn't available, it's in a museum, but this watch, the 3017 or 3017, was more readily available. Now, what are we talking about today? We're talking about a re-release of the Strela chronographs by Volmax. It comes in two dials. One of them is extremely similar to one of the original 3017s that I own in my personal collection, which I'm going to show in detail in this episode. That one actually is a 3017 column wheel driven, and you can see the column wheel in the movement, as opposed to now these have the 3133. The Strela chronographs, the original, which had a 45-minute counter as opposed to the 30-minute summing action that's on the 3133, and they did not have a date. They were in service from 1959 to 1979, and actually my particular one is extremely similar with some slight variations to one worn by Gubarov in space in 1978. And to all of our Russian viewers, I apologize if I am mispronouncing Gubarov. The paddle hands that you see on my watch and on the reissue by Sturmanskie, those were produced in the mid-1960s. Now, the other one that we have is a little more dressy. It's actually interesting how most of the early versions of the Strela were actually very dressy watches. Well, not dressy, but they were dressier than you would think would be for a military issue wristwatch. As opposed to when you get into the later models like the black dial version with the paddle hands and the and all of the other accoutrements that come along, the tachometer and so forth. They looked more military, they looked more in that ilk, whereas the early ones had fairly simple plain dials and looked dressier, which is in the vein of the beige Strela. Now we're going to go to some exclusive video footage of Valentin Volodko, the president of the Volmax company, and Igor Zavlovsky, the managing director of Vostok Europe. This is me interviewing them in Vilnius, Lithuania, at the Vostok Europe headquarters. Everybody's been waiting for these. These are out now too, right? The Strela reissues.
Еще будет rose gold.
Yes, there's a rose gold version as well.
So you understand Russian, I see. I didn't translate it.
That's true, you didn't. I'm starting to get a little bit of it, I guess. Now, the story of the Strela, maybe I rattled on about the Swifts earlier, so why don't you tell the story of the Strela model and where that originated from, and we can talk about that.
So, original Strela watches were produced in 60-te годы,
71 году выпуск начался, да, 60
end of 60s, middle of 60s, and the watches were used for Russian Soviet cosmonauts.
Right, the first spacewalk, right?
Yes.
They were wearing a Strela.
It was very famous. It was one from the first chronographic watches ever produced by first Moscow watch factory.
Okay. Which was the 3017, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Там не было календаря.
this movement was without date calendar, for example, and not shock resistant balance.
Okay.
Have no shock resistant balance. And
So it was kind of the precursor to the 3133.
the 3133 is more technically is more advanced than previous movement. And this watch is exact replica of original Strela, but of course in bigger size.
Right, and adding the Sturmanskie name, because
Yes.
that's the brand name now that it's
Sure.
produced under. Because no one really ever owned the Strela name as a brand. It was as we were discussing at lunch. It's kind of like N1 Rocket is a model of but it's not a brand. They are extremely, they're not exactly, they're not replicas. They don't look exactly like the original Strelas. They're just very true to the look with an updating. First of all, they're 44 millimeter cases, and the originals were less than 40. They come with a sapphire crystal. The originals came with an acrylic crystal. They're much thicker. They're bulkier. They have the 3133, which took over from the 3017 in the 1980s, which is a cam-driven chronograph movement, which is now the ubiquitous movement in all of the mechanical Russian chronographs, basically, the 3133, which you're more than familiar with. That's what's in the new version of the Strela. Of course, and it does have a date as well, unlike the original. It has an exhibition case back. This is something that did not exist in those early models of the Strela or any of the Russian watches in that time. In fact, the case back on the original Strelas is just a plain stainless case back. There's not even any etching or anything. It's very simple. Whereas this has an exhibition case back. It is a numbered limited edition. None of the originals were, so forth and so on. So there are real differences between the two watches, but the look, feel, the overall impact of these new Strelas by Sturmanskie is very much in the spirit of the original Strela. Now, I would encourage anybody. It used to be you could pick up the original Strelas for a couple $100. Now, ones in really good condition go for 500 or more. But look around on eBay. I would encourage anybody who's into Russian watches to get their hands on one of the originals. But the next best thing that's available now on the market that you're not going to be worried about beating up if you wear it, if you were to get your hand on a mint condition Strela, and mine isn't. I wish it were. It's a good example. It's in very good shape, but it's not mint. You get the Sturmanskie update. Now, one of the things the purists talk about is none of the original Strelas were ever under the name Sturmanskie. That is true. However, for Volmax to produce this watch and have it properly branded, Sturmanskie is a brand name that Volmax owns. Strela is not owned by anyone. So in order for Volmax to be able to protect the watch they're producing, they had to use a brand. Sturmanskie made the most sense since it was the original watch in space on the wrist of Yuri Gagarin. Some other quick stats. It's a 22 millimeter strap on this one, obviously much bigger than the 18s on the originals. It does have the sapphire crystal. It's a 42-hour power reserve on the 3133. These are only 3 ATM water resistant. This isn't intended to be a diving watch. This is a watch for everyday wear. Beautiful, beautiful timepiece with an amazing history. Don't miss out. These are limited editions, and I can tell you from past experience, when they're gone, you're going to call me up, you're going to email me looking for one, and they're going to be gone. So there it is. Don't miss out on your chance to get a piece of Russian watch history and to really have bookends of that history. If you can get your hands on an original, and one of the new models. As always, thanks for watching. I'm Craig Hester, the Watch Comrade, and keep watching.